Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome in, welcome in. We're going to give people a couple of minutes to join us here and get situated. We are very excited about everyone being here today. So I'm just going to continue to let people in. Feel free to come on camera. And just so everyone is aware, we are going to be recording this event and we are streaming it. So I'm going to go ahead and start that up. Okay, we have a couple more minutes. We're just going to let people come in before we get started, but thank you everyone for joining us here today. Okay. Great. Mm. Okay, let's see the chat here. All right. Okay, so as people continue to fill in, we will get started. Just want to welcome everyone again. I will start by introducing myself to you. My name is Jessica, and I lead the marketing at CRSLI. If you don't know, CRSLI is where we take a scholarly, research-backed approach to supporting school districts on their equity journey through a culturally responsive school leadership framework. So before we get started, we do like to get a feel for who it is that our events like this, EQUITYx, are attracting. So if you would be so kind, if you have access to the chat feature, to just let us know what your role in education is in the chat before we get this conversation started. But with that said, I'm very, very excited to introduce what is now our second season of EQUITYx. So for those that don't know, EQUITYx is our event series that connects you with leading scholars in educational equity, anti-racism, and social justice. And just so that you guys know, if you missed last season, don't worry. You are able to find all of those talks and conversations on our podcast, which is called Equity Unlocked, and you can listen to that anywhere that podcasts stream. So definitely make sure that you check that out. And again, that was Equity Unlocked. Now, as we continue to let people in and join us, I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our guest, Dr. Darius Stanley. He is the author of hashtag Black Educators Matter, the experience of Black teachers in an anti-Black world. And today, Dr. Stanley is going to be diving into the critical role of Black educators, the systemic challenges that they face, and the transformative impact that they have on students of color. So I am seeing all of your different roles popping up in the chat. Thank you for sharing those there. With those roles, we know how important conversations like this are. So make sure that you stick around because towards the end, we will have a facilitated interview, but also open up the floor for a live Q&A where you'll have a chance to ask Dr. Stanley any questions that you have directly. So yeah, with that, welcome, Dr. Stanley. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
No, thank you all for being here, and thank you for the warm welcome. Y'all have had some great friends and heavy hitters on this, so I'm excited to be in that community.
Absolutely. So whenever you're ready, feel free to get started as people get settled. Yeah, super excited to say today.
Screen, all that visible. Okay, awesome. Well, again, no, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm excited to be in this space. Dr. Khalifa and his work. We actually ran into each other at Michigan State for a brief period of time. So just knowing that brother and the type of work that he's been doing for sustained periods of
Hi,
time.
can you feed the dog?
Oh,
Oh,
I I mean, you can go ahead and continue. Sorry about
has is his mentorship and support and his scholarship has been super valuable. So I'm just grateful to be again in this number with you all. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking. I actually prefer more dialogue, so I'm excited to get to the interview and Q&A portion of this. But I wanted to kind of introduce some ideas around what it means when people say Black educators matter, and what is how do we situate that in a context and in a world that is imbued with anti-Blackness at its core, right? This endemic nature of anti-Blackness. But before I get too deep into that, I always sort of like to give a quick shout out to the reason why I do this work, right? And the reason why this work is critical and important to me, right? And so all of the folks in these pictures, including myself, have in some way contributed to my education, my educational background, my commitments to education. My child's in daycare right now, like trying to learn what early childhood education is, right? Like, so really trying to think about what it means to be an educator in this context, right? And how we are tethered to the ways in which my grandmother, who was a librarian for 40 years, and my aunt, who was a librarian, the first Black librarian in our county for 40 years, right? Like, what does it mean to be how are we tethered to those legacies, right? Is the big question. And so if you look at this picture in the top with me and in some younger days, I have this shirt on with Inspire, and this book kind of is inspired in many ways by my experiences as a K-12 educator back in Florida, right? I'm originally from Florida. And so I spent time in the classroom trying to understand, right? Like, what does it mean to be a Black historian that happened to teach, right? And that's kind of how I framed my work. But I realized quickly that the historical content, the subject matter expertise and knowledge was not of value in that particular space, right? And so I eventually exited the classroom, realizing that there's something wrong with these institutions and these districts that position Black people in many ways as sort of stanchions, people who are meant to uphold a particular narrative and an exclusive narrative, right? And so thinking about what my grandmother told me, my parents told me about their Black educational experiences, and seeing how diametrically opposed they were to my experience, right? In many ways, pushed me out of the field and forced me to think bigger, right? And so this book ends up being sort of a dream project that brings together these historical legacies, but tries to envision a future where my subject matter, my ideas, and what I'm trying to do to be interruptive in the classroom um, of these master narratives is at the center of the Black educational experience and Black educators' lives. And so, so much of this work that I talk about, the scholarly impetus of it, if you will, is from Michelle Foster's Black Teachers on Teaching, written in 1997. I read this book my first year in the academy, and it literally changed the way I thought about my own life as a Black educator, but the futurity of Black education and Black educators, right, in particular, right? It was the only book that I read to that point that was specifically about Black teaching and learning. And utilizing lenses and frameworks that were unique to our experiences collectively, but also name sort of our diasporic realities, right? And so since that time, a lot of scholarship has advanced for sure, but gotten to a point where we're saying educators of color more predominantly than we're saying Black education and Black educators, right? And I struggled with that, right? Because in some ways, in that bigger body of scholarship, Black educators' lives become sort of flattened and trivialized, or in some ways subsumed in a larger rhetoric around how do we just recruit and retain educators of color when our lives and our experiences and the barriers that we face are in some ways fundamentally different. Not to say that there are not threads, right? And so this book kind of comes out of that frustration, intellectual frustration, and thinking about, all right, how can I collectively bring together some of the best scholars in the field, people I grew up with, senior scholars who I look up to, like Dr. Foster, like Dr. Lotta Jackson, like Dr. Lomote, to really anthologize in some ways, right? Sort of a continuum of what Black educators have been and continue to be in school environments, right? With the tension that none of us are perfect, right? I think that's the part that people start to flatten our experiences in ways like we're not always right collectively or individually. Yet that we often come into the field with a mindset and a perspective of interrupting logics that oppressed us, right? And so to bind this book together, right? I really thought about, there's a lot of edited books out there, and I read a lot of them before I got into this particular project. And I said, a lot of these books feel disjointed. They're great individual chapters, but how do you make an edited text align when you have all of these great scholars, these great minds? How do we bind these conversations together, right? And so I think Demas's and Ross's sort of conceptualization of anti-Blackness was stuck out to me as a way to sort of help frame this dialogue intentionally, right? And essentially what I am trying to sort of name is this tension of being a Black educator and a human and labor and work and activity, right? With this broader societal global narrative of Black people being less than human, right? And so what is that tension? What does it mean to be a Black professional in a society that doesn't see you as a human being, right? And that's something that I try to tease out in this particular iteration of the book, of a project, I should say. And so to do that, I developed these three framings that are woven throughout the book, right? This notion of Black educators as objects, right? And so what I mean by that is this idea that Black educators often are situated as the problem needing to be fixed, as Du Bois had talked about in Souls of Black Folks, right? Always the object of policy reform, but not the designer of policy and equity-focused reform, right? We need to recruit Black teachers in. We need to get them here into our perfect system, right? Is the underground or background logics to it, right? But no questioning of the system and the structures that have excluded them historically and contemporarily. And so I think about sort of how Black educators, in my experience, and a lot of the scholarship talks about, come into the field to interrupt, as I said before, sort of the oppressive logics that press upon Black youth in particular, but pressed upon them. Myself, I always go back to the white educator that I had early on in my career that kept telling my parents that I missed the gifted and talented exam cut score by 3 points in 3 consecutive years, right? So what are the types of logics? What are the types of ideas you have to have in your head, right, to exclude someone because of 1 or 2 points in 3 consecutive years, or to fabricate a narrative that that's what happened in order to maintain a white gifted and talented program, right? But we're not just here to interrupt, right? We're here to imagine and dream forward, right? And so this book sort of captures these nuances and weaves these ideas that none of it is in and of itself a static reality, that Black educators are walking into spaces understanding many times that they are the objects of change, right? The person is positioned as change, but leveraging what they know, their ancestral legacies and their commitments to justice, to interrupt and dream about what's possible moving forward. And so there's some major themes in this book, really trying to restore the historical record. I talk about my undergrad at FAMU is in history. And so it's all about recentering and restoring sort of the restating or correcting, if you will, the historical record on Black educators. We tend to start that narrative in more contemporary and modern histories post 1954. But if we think about sort of pre 1954, and even, going back to Heather Williams' self-taught, right? Black education existing in the hulls of slave ships on the way across the Atlantic and on plantations, right? We have to correct that record to understand what the full length of our legacies, and even in pre-colonial Africa, right? And so those are the kinds of ways that I'm interested in across this particular text. I'm interested in correcting that record. And so I start off the book really with in chapter one, an introduction, just naming and affirming that we are capable and worthy and the fullness of our humanity and recognizing and dreaming about what's possible, right? Because what sort of to interrupt the logics of being the object, right? You have to start with the affirmation that we're already capable, right? And not always being positioned as the problem needing to be fixed, the thing to be researched, the object to be moved as a chess piece to make sure that we control these Black children, which is often the logics that inform particular recruitment initiatives, which is what I'm arguing a lot in this text. But Black educators and this notion of mattering and being, right, we are often, as I was, situated in classrooms that are overwhelmingly Black and brown youth, my classroom being overwhelmingly Black and brown males who had already been disregarded by the institution, right? And so in this work of mattering, Cesare Warren and Brandon Lane in this chapter talk about this notion of secure attachments and its connection to the Black radical imagination, if you read Robin D.G. Kelly's work, right? And so being able to name what we're fighting against, right, for sure, but also more intentionally naming what we're fighting for, right? And so there's this freedom dreaming praxis that happens through the relationships between Black teachers and students in classrooms as an interruptive logic. But we have to contend with what we're fighting against. And so I tend to be on that side of it. Oftentimes the continuum of what does it mean to name the structure, right? Confront the ghost that's in front of us, right? Oftentimes, right? And so I center this notion of anti-Black institutional logics to name the everyday ways in which Black social death and Black social suffering show up in these seemingly invisible school processes, right? And so I can talk more about that later, but these arrangements are deeply colonial. They connect back to sort of the Black plantation overseer. And I'm talking about the ways in which districts and schools are hiring Black teachers and using them as the de facto disciplinarian rather than the subject matter expert, right? And so to harken back to this notion of emancipation and interruptive logics, right? Dr. Kristen Duncan, who is a great friend, someone I've grown up in this field with, right, talks about these notions of what it means to be an emancipatory pedagogue, right? And she talks about her experiences teaching and alongside this science teacher. And she says, the science teacher next door had her students studying Black scientists so that they know that Black Americans have always been scientists and that expertise in the subject was not reserved for those of non-Black races, right? And we helped our students see that poverty or the absence of Black people in an exclusive space is not caused by Black inferiority, but instead that white supremacy causes both and lays that blame at the feet of so-called Black inferiority, right? And so these dominant discourses or narratives that blame the victim for their positions in society, the exclusion of Black folks from STEM, right? Again, Black science teachers interrupting those logics in real time, right? And so that's what I mean by this notion of interruptive. And then finally, kind of this sort of important through line throughout, right? But really is embossed a bit more at the tail end of the text is this notion of freedom dreams, right? And Dr. Justin Coles is a great friend of mine, wrote this beautiful chapter around Black aesthetics. And it talks about this notion of centering Black backdrops, right? And not centering white supremacist frames to name the experiences of Black people. And he says, if the education of Black children indeed causes incalculable suffering at the hands of white supremacist logics, it is the role of Black educators to decenter those gazes and logics. It simply means we can't just teach flatly that George Washington was the great creator of our nation, right? We have to interrupt those logics, right? We can't begin our histories with the study of chattel slavery, but Black people existed in ways in the self-determining ways prior to and beyond that particular time in history that our books tend to tell us, right? And we have to create classrooms where their students can see beyond the hold of the slave ship, the violence of that particular idea as an abstract concept, right? But a very real reality for Black children in classrooms. So what is the relationship between the hold of the slave ship and what the classroom looks like as a containment space, right? Where does the light enter for the Black child in U.S. curricula beyond the Hole's language of violence? Centering a Black gaze is not about creating classroom space that stamps out all of the cultural exposure, Rather, it is about affirming Black cultures as a worthy lens to see and move through the world. And I think that's just a beautiful interpretation of what this book, the essence of this book, is trying to say, is that we're not interested in this zero-sum game, right, that white supremacy tends to situate as the narrative. Well, if you get something, then I'm going to lose something. It is to say that we have to correct the historical record and center the gazes that most affirm our students, right? And so to kind of close out this idea, I close the book with this rumination that tries to bring together these different chapters. And if you could bear with me for a second, I'll try to work through this. It says, despite a world imbued with anti-Black and colonial preoccupations, Black educators have relentlessly centered Black liberation at the core of their praxis. They're continuously co-imagine worlds with students through Black aesthetics. They leap the hurdles of exclusionary state standards and licensure practices. They shield themselves and their students from explicit and implicit anti-Black violence by prioritizing self-sustainment and centering emancipatory pedagogies. Black educators traverse the troubling waters of anti-Black social school environments saturated in logics of Black inferiority and disposability. These same educators are connected to a rich legacy of Black teaching and learning, leveraged to refuse American chattel slavery. Black educators built and sustained educational institutions premised on their liberatory dreams. They intentionally created spaces for Black freedom dreaming praxis. These educators continue to build the necessary attachments with Black youth as a means of survival and to envision new possibilities. Therefore, future research, policymaking, leadership praxis, recruitment, sustainment, you name it, right, that concerns Black educators must simultaneously recognize Black educational resistance and co-imagine Black intellectual and pedagogical possibilities. And so what that sort of means, right, is this idea of going back to centering the Black gaze as we think about Black educators, right, is that we have to interrupt the logics that situate Black educators as the stanchions, the upholders of existing colonial arrangements, right? What does it take for district level superintendents, for principals, for those who are interested, right, in hiring and recruiting Black educators to reframe the ways in which they think about what they are capable of, and what their roles are in schools, right? And this extends to, there's a chapter on Black superintendents, this extends to Black principals, et cetera, right? And so there's this broad interpretation of it, right? But what I want to kind of just put a peg in and close with, right, is this idea of this book really being a critical pause. It's intended to generate a type of uneasiness, because most folks will read the title and say, okay, this is going to help me recruit Black teachers. No, this actually might help you think about it a little bit longer, right? And so these ideas of what are the conditions in which our schools are ready, right, for the ideas that Black educators are willing to bring into the field. And not all Black we have to interrupt the flatness and the right, and the monolithic, right? But to say that many of us do not get into this field to uphold the existing colonial order. And so what does it mean to interrupt those logics prior to engaging in the work of recruitment? And so that's the extent sort of what I wanted to say in this sort of by myself portion. But I'm excited to engage in more intentional dialogue with the group. So.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley. Also, love a good QR code. So everyone, please make sure that you guys yeah, get a copy from Dr. Stanley to kind of further your education. And yeah, further support him for showing up for us in this way today to educate us. As we move into our structured interview segment, I just, yeah, really want to take a moment to emphasize the importance of this conversation. I really think that the work is shedding a light on the experience of Black educators, and that's really just really vital for everyone here who I know is committed to fostering equitable educational environment. So yeah, while you guys scan that QR code, I have just a few questions here for you, Dr. Stanley, before we open up the floor to everyone else. So my first question is, what should leaders in districts who are interested in recruiting or hiring Black educators be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the point I was trying to sort of tease out there at the end, right? Is, you know, I, I'm actually writing another paper right now around the Black principleship, but really trying to think about what are the conditions that are necessary, right, for Black educators to thrive. And that question, the answer to that question is not too different from what are the conditions that are necessary for Black students to thrive and Black educational communities to thrive, right? And I think um, there's a sort of hasty logic, especially in the post pandemic. I'm gonna stop sharing. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
There's a sort of hasty logic in a post pandemic um, America, right? Which is slowly being repealed, actually. But there's a hasty logic to fight fires, right? Dr. Sonia Douglas wrote this great book about learning in a burning house and sort of taking this idea that Martin Luther King talked about, right? I fear, this concept that I fear we've integrated into a burning house, right? And so oftentimes districts and leaders recognize that the house is on fire, right? To use that analogy, but they hire Black folks and brown folks and indigenous folks as firefighters to put out the fire, right? But we didn't set the fire, right? We didn't start it. That's a whole song, right? We didn't start the fire. We didn't start the fire, but we're hired to put it out, right? And I think that ends up being sort of the logic, even in with the best of intentions, is like, oh, we have these problems around Black literacy rates. They're terrible. They're in the toilet. We have these problems around Black exclusionary discipline, right? We have these problems around Black special education, right? But again, even that logic of naming the victim as the problem is the fundamental premise that we're trying to interrupt, right? And so much of what I say is not, it's not a direct answer, but so much of what I say around what district leaders and superintendents and those who are in charge of hiring need to be thinking about, it begins with the self, right? How do you envision the issues or the tensions in your school and district environment? Part one. And then part two, what do you think the role of Black educators and leaders, et cetera, are in schools? And are they different than the way in which you see majority educators and leaders? Those are the questions you need to ask before you get on the campaign of coming to FAMU where I was at to recruit me to come to X, Y, and Z district. Like those questions aren't being asked. And so we're asking them to put the fires out. And then we say, look, they don't want to be in the field anymore when they're burnt out, right? And it's just an absurd logic. And so I think that's the thing is what are the conditions that are in place to sustain Black educators? Have I interrogated, right, the anti-Blackness that is permeating my school building, my district, my community context, people who don't like change, people who are not used to change in that way, right? People who are averse to open enrollment policies that allow Black and brown and indigenous youth into their schools, right? This notion of the suburban white privileged school as my school and that's y'all school over there, right? Like those are the kinds of logics that have to be interrupted before we can even begin a conversation about around Black teacher recruitment and sustainment.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, with all of that said, I know this is a little general, but what do you think that the Black educators' future looks like? What does
Yeah.
the future look like for Black educators?
Yeah, and it's a big question, right? It's huge, right? But I think there's a number of things that immediately come to mind when I think about like futures. I actually use history to inform futures. So I go back to what was and imagine what can be. And so when my aunt, who I referenced earlier, she said, and I laugh about it now because we had some good conversation around it. But she would say, one of the worst things that ever happened is when they integrated schools, right? And I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, Leon County. Integration was slow down there like it was in most parts of the South. But she said, we lost something, and I'm trying to name what that loss is. I mean, I know our textbooks weren't as great, but we lost some things in that process. And I meditated on that idea for a moment to think about, well, I think there's some nuance that could be applied to the reasoning, but I get it. And I actually talked to another great mentor and elder in my community, and he said, they were at that time sort of going to those schools. We didn't know what we had, in the sense that all the processes were informed through Black lenses. Every policy, every practice, every sort of subtle thing that we name, we don't really name or they don't even know, right? They were all filtered through Black lenses, right? And so it brings this question to bear, is like, okay, well, as we think about what was lost and then what was replaced in our current iterations of schools, we have Black people and Black bodies and Black minds operating on somebody else's agenda, right? And so in that agenda, in order for it to maintain its access and privilege and opportunities, right? Sort of this notion of opportunity hoarding, right? In order to maintain that, right, it has to dehumanize and exclude, right? And so I'm getting to a point here, but the idea is that the future of Black educators and Black leaders depends in some ways, if we're going to operate within this system, depends in some ways for the system to be malleable to Black ideas in education and to recognize Black humanity. This is a broader abstract, idea, but the future of Black education hinges on that. Because if we can't interrupt the logics that are intentionally centered to exclude our minds, what we have conceptualized, then it's impossible to imagine a future forward in my view, right? And I tend not to go down the line of separate institutional building. I think there's a space for that as well, right? The development of independent Black institutions being those spaces, right? And I see those as useful counter spaces as well. But what I'm saying generally is that there has to be institutional malleability. We have to demand that. There has to be systemic malleability. We have to demand that in order for the futures of Black educators to exist in their fullness, right? Otherwise, we're bodies inside of somebody else's logics.
Yeah, I mean, that was an incredible answer to that question, broad or not. Um, I want to use this time as an opportunity to open up the floor to anyone who has questions or just any contributions to the conversation here. But I will start with a question that I did see that came through the chat. Zakia said, what are some examples of conditions school leaders can establish in their communities? So I just want to give you a chance to weigh in on that.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I always struggle with is examples, because context is always so important. But there are some through lines that I think I've seen in practice that I think are useful ways to start to get the ball rolling on this. And one of them is something that we all know generally, is this notion of affinity groups. They have been useful. They are helpful. And when intentionally situated in districts and in schools where you have sort of these cadres or cohorts of Black educators in the same space, getting intentional professional development, looking at Dr. Mosley stuff with Black Teacher Project being one of those examples. Even the work here in Minnesota with Black Men Teach, there's very intentional work happening around bringing Black folks together, because as you think about Travis Bristol's work in particular, I think about that is, this notion of loners and groupers, and who's more likely to be sustained, right? Well, if you are a loner, and that happens a lot, especially in a state like Minnesota, right, where you're the one Black teacher or the one teacher of color in a particular school space, that space is automatically unwelcoming to who you are, right? Just by your sheer body, right? So what does it mean to be a grouper and be collective in your work, but not just go have your affinity group? I want to be clear about that. right? But what are the structures, the resources, and supports, and the intentionality around making it a part of institutional and district way of operating? To me is one of the key things that's really important. The other piece around sort of the conditions, and this is broader, right? But as I say as I say in the text, like Black teachers, leaders, superintendents are tethered in many ways to the experiences of Black youth in schools, right? And so one of the primary conditions that have to be interrupted is the exclusion of Black youth in all ways, right? So as we think about exclusion from gifted and talented, exclusion from special ed, well, the overrepresentation in special ed, exclusion through discipline and suspension, like those conditions generate the type of what we call turnover now, exclusion from the field. Those are the conditions. Those are the conditions. So how are you interrupting those things to suggest that, oh no, Black humanity has space here? Where Black, right? Like that's the question that needs to be asked. And so as a wrapping up of answering, right? Affinity groups that have a mentor component that are institutionalized and situated in district resources and supports have proved to be effective and supportive. But also this notion of ensuring that the conditions experienced by Black youth, right, are also not ones that are rooted in exclusion and dehumanization, right? And so those are the kinds of things that um, make sense, right, in response to that.
Awesome. I don't know, Zakia, if you want to respond to that or come off mic to ask another question, or at this point, I would love to open the floor to anyone that wants to raise their hand or come off mic to utilize this time to ask Dr. Stanley any more questions or contribute to the conversation. So we'll use that time now. Don't be shy.
Hi, Dr. Stanley. This is Raina.
Hey,
How are you? I really just wanted to extend appreciation for when you were wrapping up your, individual piece. You mentioned kind of at the end that you hope that your book, you know that people will pick up your book to think about how to recruit Black educators, and that the idea is that they're going to think differently about that um, and think differently about the systems in which they are recruiting Black educators into, right? How are we nourishing Black educators? I just think that that's incredibly powerful. There's this urgency to recruit educators who look more like our students. And there's this like push and pull, this urgency, I think, is causing this urgency along with a history of bias and systemic dehumanization that is kind of it can lead the dialogue into like I don't know, like what comes to mind, like buying cattle, right? You're not just you're these are human beings. You don't just recruit and hoard human beings and use them as resources without thinking about how these human beings are dignified and nourished in the spaces that you're recruiting them into. And it's not like one can wait for the other necessarily. Like I don't think we can wait to recruit until we have a system that nourishes Black educators, because then it's white people for the most part who are deciding what nourishes Black educators. And so just understanding this nuance and complexity. So I'm really excited to dig into that with your book.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like so coming from K-12, right? I realized that you kind of get to wax poetic a little bit in a text. But there are inherent tensions, this urgency, I think that you're naming that's really important. So all of it becomes sort of this push and pull. I think your point's well taken. Like I think that the thing that troubles me, right, is that I see Black educators young like I was, right, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, ready to do something. And then this notion of spirit motoring hits them, right, as soon as they walk into the door. Your spirit is torn apart because you see the conditions of Black children, and then you think about what that means for what you need to do, and you end up taking up batons, right, trying to be the champion and the martyr, and then you wonder why 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line, this is no longer a sustainable activity, right? And so it's I don't want to see those folks leave the field. And I need y'all to fix these systems that make that a reality. It's such a deep tension, but no, I appreciate sort of the orientation around it. I don't propose any necessarily solutions. I'll always propose questions. So
So I did see that another question came through in the chat here, so I will read this for you, Dr. Stanley. Specifically, what pathways externally should school leaders establish for Black teachers to disrupt some of the barriers facing them? Career ladders, compensation, cultural competence. What internal practices should leaders take on personally?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think the impetus of this particular um project, podcast, webinar, right? Culture responsive school leadership is a frame that is abundantly useful in interrupting oppressive logics. Like that's the impetus of it in my read of it, in my understanding of it. Um, and so it begins certainly internally with what folks have called critical professional development, which is essentially this notion that we got to stop doing PD that is state sanctioned for the goals of state sanctioned, achievement and, school improvement, right? That critical professional development is about interrupting logics that are oppressive to those who have been marginalized historically. And so to what extent do our professional development activities that we engage in monthly or biweekly or what have you interrupt those logics? Like that's the number one question. And most of the time the answer to that question is none of them. Right. So I think PD is a huge piece. I think sort of this notion of critical self-reflection as a praxis that is embedded in the culture responsive school leadership framework is a huge piece of the internal work. That needs to be something that's deeply embedded in all leadership preparation programs. I know we're working on it here. People are working on it, but it's moving too slow, if I'm being honest, right? So those are the kinds of things that have to be happening internally because you shouldn't be licensed as a principal if you have some of these logics. That's just a fact, right? The second part of that, in terms of the external pieces, there's a lot of research historically and contemporarily about Black teachers in particular being having less compensation or being lower on the salary ladder. And a lot of that has to do with sort of, NCLB accountability policies and the ways that those worked, alternative licensure programs that Black teachers tend to be well represented in, and the way that districts read that, right? And so there's a lot of sort of technical realities to salary differences in some ways. I'm not necessarily proposing a policy agenda per se in that way, but I am saying that there needs to be a going back to this notion of affinity groups, there needs to be an intentionality around having some mechanism at the district and school level that provides the intentional support. This concept I'm trying to play with, Black relational mentorship, where you have mentors who have experienced the things that you have experienced, that you will experience in the district in very intentional ways to support you as you are navigating it, right? And so who are the Black elders? Who are the Black community members? Who are the Black retirees? Who are the folks who have worked in these systems that can help you outmaneuver and navigate some of the things that are there, right? And so as you think about sort of those pieces, you know, there's no pretty answer to any of it, but I think that we the intent the intention, really the most important piece being the intentionality around interrupting what you think Black educators' roles are in schools. I think that's the number one. And once we interrupt that, there's a window of possibilities there, in terms of what we can do to sustain Black educators. I will also say this part. I think recognizing the inequitable access to the field is an important reality. And so we do need to have greater conversations around why Black educators cannot enter the field at the same rates as other educators. What are the mechanisms in place in terms of licensure that have excluded Black teachers broadly? And there are other sort of pieces to it too around sort of living conditions. And so one of the projects that I've worked on looks at how do we get housing stipends or down payment assistance and some of these other external programs that will require schools and districts to partner with outside entities, right? To make that work sustainable. And so there's so much wealth of knowledge and wealth, sheer wealth and material wealth out in many of our communities. But we operate in our silos in ways that are just not strategic, right? There's no reason why you shouldn't be connecting with community-based and centered city-oriented organizations that can help be a part of that sustainment conversation with Black teachers who are often coming to, you know, not coming to spaces that may or may not have the generational wealth to say, oh, I got $20,000, because prices of housing, you know, it's crazy, right? I have $20,000 to put on a house to be sustained here, right? So those are the kinds of questions that district level leaders and principals have to start asking.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley. We have another question that came through from Dr. Michael Stewart. He started off saying, yes, and it's important to recognize that often non-Black peers contribute to the reasons Black teachers leave, quote, not intentionally. How can we create culturally responsive teams of educators to help improve the school climate?
Sorry, I need to turn that light on. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I wrote a whole piece about this. But I talked about this idea that school leaders see themselves oftentimes and unfortunately as just managerial leaders. They maintain that Dr. Cleveland talks about the techno-rationality of it, right? Just get the systems going, get the procedures going, make sure everybody's where they need to be, right? And that we have to broaden our understandings of what our roles are as principals, right? And so let's take it a couple steps back. If you look at the work of the principal and cultural response featured in cultural response in school leadership, if you look at the work of Ulysses Bias and the other principles that's talked about in Vanessa Siddle-Walker's work, right? Historically, Jim Crow schooling, right? These principles were not just procedural principles. These were Black principals who were mentoring teachers and creating actively and in real time the conditions that were necessary to sustain Black students, teachers, and other leaders in that school space. You can't just do teacher evaluations. You can't just do discipline. You can't you have to broaden your analysis and broaden your conversation around what it is that you do as a school leader. And part of that is, as a field, as an educational leadership scholar, we have to broaden the way in which we conceptualize what school leadership even is, right? I think we are often stuck in those logics too. So we have some burden to bear in that space. But I think oftentimes so much of what is already being said by Dr. Khalifa in cultural responsive school leadership is that the leader has to intentionally institutionalize organizational structures, not initiatives, structures, things that are permanent, that push teachers to challenge their hidden biases or anti-Blackness in particular, right? That has to be a fixture in whether you call it PLCs or whatever the term is, right? It has to be a fixture. It has to be a fixture in professional development. And the facts are, and this is where we are at this point. The facts are, if you can't get on board with that, then you don't need to be here. And that's the reality, because you can't say you want Black teachers to be successful if we got teachers from other backgrounds, other race backgrounds that don't think Black kids can learn and don't think Black educators are as good as them. Right? It just doesn't work, right? These two things can't sit together. And so I think those are the kinds of things that, have to be thought about intentionally as at the school level and at the district level too, right? I mean, I think they have a part to play in that, but particularly in the organization in and of itself, how are we building a culture around possibility and not exclusion and dehumanization?
Excellent. So I still want to just open up the floor to anyone that wants to ask anything else of Dr. Stanley. I see in the chat, I'm curious to hear any stories people here can share from their own context that connect to this topic in the spirit of sharing on the ground challenges or insights. That's a wonderful idea. But also, before anyone raises their hand or comes off mute, I really do encourage all of you guys to explore CRSLI. We have so many different ways to opt in to further just visibilizing inequities, going through academies, and even sustaining our learning with After the Academy, which is a program that we have available on crsli.org that answers a lot of kind of like the questions about the continuing of just digging deeper. So make sure that you guys explore that. But are there any other people that would like to ask any questions or contribute to the conversation? Okay.
Oh,
If
can I? Oh, sorry, someone else talking.
no, go ahead, Candace.
It's almost like double dutch. Do I jump in? Do I wait?
Right.
Dr. Stanley, when you were sharing a little while ago about having maybe a more veteran teacher who had been in the teaching game for a while, mentoring a newer Black educator in the building, I couldn't help but smile because that was my experience when I started teaching in the school that I was in. The fortunate part is my teaching partner, I was teaching 5th grade. My teaching partner had been in the game for 25 years, my first year starting. And I learned a lot from her. She was an incredible educator. She happened to be one of the educators that was in a wave of educators who had been recruited from outside of Minnesota. I think she's from Ohio, but many of the educators during the time she came were from the South, recruited to Minnesota to teach, to diversify the teaching staff. And there were so many of them that stayed.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother story because I'd like to know why they stayed, right? Because Minnesota is Minnesota for anybody on the call that's from here. But the beautiful thing about being able to be mentored by her is that the school was seeking out a veteran teacher. And because she was the only other Black teacher in the building, she became my mentor. I'm thankful for that in many ways. I also think about the challenge of being the only Black teacher in a school, which for her, she had been the only Black teacher for 25 years in that school. She taught at a time when the kids went home for lunch. It wasn't like Little House on the Prairie. It was like a neighborhood school. They just walked home for lunch and they came back. But I say that because she also had so much bitterness that she shared with me that helped me to appreciate even more so her role, the exclusions that she experienced, being again the only Black teacher in that school. And so my question is, how do we, in the absence of having a large number of Black veteran teachers in the same schools as our new early career Black educators, how do we create like that circle of fire around them? I know you talked about affinity groups, and I'm no longer in a district, but I'm thinking that if I were still in a district now, that would be a question I'd be thinking about is how do we support those teachers that are the singletons in a building, just trying to make it day to day. They can't wait for their third week, week 3 when they meet with their power mentor or whoever their mentor person is.
Right. No, that's good. I mean, I think that's one of the big challenges too, right? It's sort of the isolation factor that is present in some districts for sure, some schools, right? There used to be a strong presence, and I think it's kind of changed a little bit here lately of the National Association of Black Educators. And those associations had local chapters across these districts, and you may have interfaced with them. But those tend to be sort of the formalized connective tissue between educators who are situated in the context that you're describing. But I think, to take a step back, like, I think that's part of the tension with Black mentorship, which is why I'm trying to push this notion of relational mentorship as a framing, because what I do not need necessarily, right, is all the baggage dropped on my front door, right, as I'm trying to become this new teacher, right? But I need to know kind of like the green book, right? Like, where's the space of safety? Where are the sites of suffering? How do I navigate this, right? So this navigational capital that Dr. Yoso talks about in community culture wealth. And so what I'm always thinking about is, yes, we need veteran mentors to paint broader sort of macro pictures, right? But who are the folks kind of in that in-between spot, right? And how can we layer mentorship that says, well, I'm experiencing this right now, and I'm not 20 years in the game, I'm 10, I'm 8, I'm 6, but I know more than you at 1 or 2, right? What are these sort of like collages or sort of these, I call it sort of multi-generational versions of mentorship that give me a long view, a short view, immediate view of how I should be thinking about the contemporary realities in which I am navigating, which is why I say this notion of a cohort, this notion of folks, a lot of what Black men teachers doing here, but in other spaces as well, is like, how do we get people collectively together that are at different points in their career in a very intentional way? And you know how Black folks are. I mean, the thing about us is that we're communal in nature, and so we find who we need to find, because the district not going to do it for us, right? So we either find them or we like, that's just how it works. Oh yeah, I went to church yesterday. Oh yeah, you working, what you call it? You by yourself? Oh, we need to talk, right? And so now we eating dinner, but that's just the way that we operate. And I think that, I ended up doing that in the classroom, but I shouldn't have had to. I should have, but the other piece too, to your point, your story made me think of this reading teacher I used to work with, and she similarly had been at that school for 20 years. And so I saw her one day, and she was upset. And she was just like, I'm leaving this place. I'm never coming back. And it was because we had a new AP, and she gave her a bad evaluation score, basically, right? And Florida was high accountability, still is, right, at that time. And so her evaluation score was the worst she had ever had in 20 years of teaching. And she said, it can't be me, so it's got to be you. And so that the mentorship happened naturally, in the sense that I just saw her in the hallway, and I was like, I just had a bad interview. I just had a bad evaluation score too, right? What does this mean? And so she actually organized a group of us to go talk to the AP at that time. Like, that's kind of how it worked. And so again, there's this, as I talk about this tetheredness of experience, whereas we think about Black crit, we're talking about sort of this notion of shared suffering and pain, but there's also this piece that's interruptive and imaginative, that's like, out of this pain, we're organized and collective and connected in these very intentional ways. And so I just think that's natural to the experience of being a Black educator. And what districts have to ask is, what do we need to do to make that not a necessity, right? Like, that ends up being the question.
Thank you so much.
If I could jump in, Dr. Stanley, to react to your last comment, it's almost like it's the white administrators who need the mentorship from maybe Black administrators of like Afrocentric schools or Black independent schools. So to kind of learn, what does a Black-centered lens look like, and what does support and nourish Black teachers and Black students. So it sounds like the mentorship there should also be a mentorship, for white administrators.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a space for that. I want to be hesitant about overburdening Black leaders and other leaders of color, but at the same time, you're absolutely right. Like, you have to interrupt the lens. And sometimes the best way to do that, right, is to hear what a lot of scholars call difficult knowledge, things that don't jive directly with the way in which your epistemological stance, the ways in which you've seen the world, right? You need something that interrupts that. I had a great professor back in grad school. He said, my number one goal, I have two goals: to thoroughly unnerve you, right, this semester. I don't care if you learn anything. I just want to unnerve you, right? And the second thing he said was, um, my goal is to make the familiar strange. The things that we've taken for granted, right? I need to make that really strange to you by the time you walk out of here. I mean, he was successful in that practice. So to your point, right? I think this notion of mentorship is about, I keep saying interruptive, right? But it's about interrupting the oppressive epistemological stances that we walk into school leadership, district leadership with, right? And we have to do it in a way that doesn't overburden Black and brown and indigenous educators and leaders, right? We got to find a way to make sure that works in a way that's symbiotic, right? And that's the work.
Absolutely. That was, I think, similar to Candace's sentiments, very, very timely altogether, all the information that was shared today. I know that we're coming to a close here as far as our scheduled time. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Stanley, just coming and sharing space with us. I don't know if you want to put your QR code back up for people one last time to be able to find your work and support you. Also, keep in mind, everyone, I'm putting in the chat here. We would love for you to stay connected with us at Sierra SLI on social. So following us any and everywhere that you consume media is preferred. Just so you know, we are in the works right now of putting together a giveaway for a free equity audit, which is very much in alignment with everything that we talked about today. So at CRSLI, we do equity audits where, it's research-based audits that basically identify whatever equity issues that you're having within your district, and we provide you with customized strategies for going about solving those. So stay tuned and stay connected with us to find out more details about that. And of course, we will continue to do these EQUITYx events every month for the remaining of the 24-25 school year. And thank you again so much, Dr. Stanley. So if there's nothing else that anyone wants to contribute or say, I think that we can close for the day. I'll leave it to you to say any final words about where they can find you or how to support you, Dr. Stanley.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate, obviously, all the work that CRSLI is doing and has done and done for my own work. This is kind of the first project of my scholarship. I'm currently in the works of writing my next book, and I'm super excited to continue that work. So send me an email at any time if you just want to chat. I'm good at chatting, as you can see. So thank y'all for giving me this space to talk.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you all again. And yeah, we will see you all at hopefully the next EQUITYx, which you'll get more information about in your inboxes soon. Yeah, take care, guys. Have a good evening.
Yes, Jessica, that was great.